California. Good evening, members and guests. Welcome to the Book Club of California's presentation for Monday, November 21st, 2022. Tonight's program is titled Adolph Sutro and the Bradshawe Library Pamphlets. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. For those of you who might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes finely made limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. And we host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much, much more. So if you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed, I strongly encourage you to consider that membership. Our dues are modest and the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go to our website at bccbooks.org. And now for tonight's program, titled Adolph Sutro and the Bradshawe Library Pamphlets. Tonight, our speaker is Alan H. Nelson. Alan Nelson is Professor Emeritus in the Department of English at the University of California, Berkeley. His specializations are paleography, bibliography, and the reconstruction of the literary life and times of medieval and Renaissance England from documentary sources. He is the author of Monstrous Adversary, The Life of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, from Liverpool University Press in 2003. He is an editor or co-editor of 3 collections in 7 volumes in the Records of Early English Drama Series, Cambridge, 1989, Oxford, 2004, and Inns of Court in 2010. He is also a major contributor of essays to Shakespeare Documented, a project sponsored by the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. His interest in owners of books in the 16th and 17th centuries is exemplified by essays in Shakespeare Quarterly and Owners, Annotators, and the Signs of Reading. Now tonight, Professor Nelson will talk about Adolph Sutro and English Civil War pamphlets from the Henry Bradshawe Library of Marple, Cheshire, now housed at the Sutro Library in the J. Paul Leonard Library of San Francisco State University. In addition to the Civil War pamphlets in the Sutro Library, Professor Nelson will comment on local books from the Bradshawe Library, including books in the Robbins Collection in the Berkeley School of Law, Stanford University Library, at 1632 Second Folio Shakespeare at the University of California, Davis, and books which he himself has collected here on display. So please, everyone, welcome to the podium our speaker, Professor Alan H. Nelson.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be able to address this group which shares interest in book ownership, which is my particular interest with me, I'm sure. There is an important connection to California, even though I'm going to be talking mostly about a family that lived in Marple in Cheshire in England.
Could you speak closer to the...
Oh, is that, yes, okay, I'll get, okay. So the connection is with Adolph Sutro, and I think I should just say a few words about who Sutro was, because maybe not everybody knows. But Sutro is a famous name in San Francisco. There are a lot of landmarks that are named after Sutro. Sutro was a mining engineer. He didn't dig out silver or gold with a pickaxe, but he rather figured out a way to drain water from the great silver mining lodes in Nevada. And it enabled to get them sort of all the silver that was in this entire mountain out of the ground. Sutro was born in 1830 and he died in 1898. So he was entirely a 19th century person. He assembled an enormous library, which would have been as large as the Huntington Library in Pasadena or the Folger Library in Washington, D.C., except for the 1906 earthquake, which destroyed something like somewhere between half and 2/3 of his huge collection. So much is left now and is preserved in San Francisco that it is astonishing to think how large the original library originally was. He was determined, I think, to be a kind of a gentleman and assemble a gentleman's library, which concentrated on California and Mexico and so forth, but also concentrated largely on the standard kind of literature and publications of England. And so my talk is going to be mostly about the Bradshawe Library of Cheshire, but at the end you will see there is a connection, how the connection to Sutro was established, and why the Sutro Library still now has this fabulous, almost unparalleled collection of 17th century English pamphlets. Now, I just want to give my thanks to a number of people, especially I've just listed them here. You have to read them, there are too many to read. But the staff of the Sutro Library, and then also Giles Mandelbrot, who was a speaker here this July over the summer, and then a number of other people that you can see on your list who have assisted me in my attempt to reconstruct this library. Now, we're talking about a little village that is so small it hardly exists. It's called Marple, and it's in Cheshire, and it is indicated by this pointer, the little red pointer, which is some distance from Chester in the county of Cheshire. And it is 215 miles by my Google map from London. So it's a pretty remote place. There is a connection that you might have wanted to know between Marple, Cheshire, and Miss Marple, because apparently Agatha Christie chose the name Miss Marple for her female detective because she rode a train that went through Marple, and the name just fascinated her. There's no real connection here at all, but it always you wonder why it's called what Marple is doing in this. The Bradshawe Library of Marple was of an unknown size. We really don't know how large it was, but currently I have been able to identify more than 125 surviving books from the library, many on legal topics, now scattered throughout libraries in England, Scotland, Wales, the United States, Canada, New Zealand. Some 30 books additionally are known from auction catalogs, but I haven't been able to track them down. Prominent among all the books from this library are pamphlets, thousands and thousands of pamphlets. Approximately 1,400, and I've seen the number 1,500, I haven't actually counted them myself, pamphlets that are now in the Sutro Library in San Francisco. This library, what happened was that when Sutro died in 1898, the library what was left of the library went to his children, who donated the library is a wonderful gift to the city of San Francisco, but without a building to put them in. And the library just wandered around San Francisco from pillar to post for many years, but has now found a permanent home in the San Francisco State University. Other pamphlets from this library, from the Bradshawe Library, are located in Exeter Cathedral Library in England, St. Andrews University, and a wonderful place which I haven't been able to visit yet because of COVID, called Milton Cottage Museum. This is John Milton collection, which is outside Oxford. Now I'm showing you a picture of a book which is from the Sutro Library, and this is one of approximately 41 or 42 volumes that are collected volumes. They're there's a German word Sammelband, which means a number of books collected into one volume. And with pamphlets, you can have 20 to 40, 60 even in one volume, depending upon the size of the original pamphlets. Just by looking at it, you can see that it's pretty beat up. It's in pretty tough condition and desperately needs conservation. You could see that in the example I'm showing you, the cover is falling off or is just held on by a thread. Nevertheless, the pamphlets themselves are in pretty good shape, and if somebody has $100,000 that they want to donate, you could probably get the whole collection properly bound and conserved. But it is safely contained in the Sutro Library today. Now, what I'm concentrating on in the first instance is that signature at the top of Henry Bradshawe, and here's an enlargement of it. Always spelled with an E, by the way, even though not everybody adds an E to the historical characters. And the question is, who is this Henry Bradshawe, whose name appears on the first title page in each of the 41 volumes that are at the Sutro Library? Who is Henry Bradshawe? The name occurs elsewhere in a different hand. There you can see Henry Bradshawe. This particular book, published in 1637, has apparently two different versions of the signature. One on the main title page, part of the title page, Henry Bradshawe. Almost always the Henry occurs on one side of a short word, like or in this case, and Bradshawe is stuck out on the other side. Somebody had a sense of obsession maybe. But there's another Henry Bradshawe whose name appears at the top of the page in this slightly different hand. Now, it turns out that there are 5 Henry Bradshawes. So you should be able to follow my lecture if you are able to count to 5. Okay, so I'm going to go through them one by one. This is a remarkable fact that the Bradshawe family of Marple was headed by the eldest surviving son for 5 generations. And in each case, each generation, that surviving son was named Henry. So be prepared to hear a lot about a lot of Henrys. So there's, I put down the dates of the full dates of this just for your information, but I'm going to refer to them mostly by their date of their death to make it kind of easier. So Henry I died in 1620, the second died in 1654, the third died in 1662, the fourth in 1698, and the fifth in 1736. In addition to this, there are 2 other Bradshaws of consequence, John and Thomas, who died in 1659 and 1744. So I'll try to keep this all sorted out by referring to them by their Roman numerals. So the first Bradshawe I'm going to talk about was Henry I, who died in 1620. And only one book survives with his name on it, but it's an extremely important book. And without this, my project would have collapsed. This is a Plowden book published in 1597, and it is a legal text, as many of the books from the library were. Now, if you look very carefully, you can see at the beginning, at the very top of the page, there is a Latin proverb, nocte dieque leges si velis discernere leges. This is a really bad Latin pun, but it means that you'll have to do a lot of reading if you were to understand or teach law. And it is signed H. Bradshawe, and with the date 1600. It's a little hard to see, but if you really squint, maybe you can see it. But you can see it's in a very calligraphic hand. It's as if the person who wrote this signature had been taught calligraphy. And it's the only hand with this, the only signature with this sort of style. But this must be Henry I, who died in 1620. But this is actually dated. I'm very grateful to him for having dated apparently his acquisition of the book of 1600. So that's the only book. It's going to come back to our attention later on, because there's another connection to this book, which is quite important. But it is sort of the beginning of the library. The second Henry died in 1654, and there is no book with his signature on it. But we do have his signature in a legal document, and you can see it says H. Bradshawe with a very irregular line underneath the signature. There's no discipline whatsoever, this line, just a scribble, the kind that I would make if I were to do it. But you'll see that this is very much in contrast to other signatures of the 5 Henry Bradshaws. So there's nothing more to say about him except that he lived so long, 1654, that his son routinely referred to himself as Henry Jr. until his father died. And he was only not junior for 6 years. Reminds me a little bit of Prince Charles, who is now King Charles, who's going to have a relatively short reign, I think, because he was so old when he started it. Okay, now, so there's not much more to say about him than that. Henry III is a very important person who has an importance apart from the library. Most of the other people are important only because they were contributed to this library. I give you here just a list of people who refer to Henry III, who died in 1662. He was the elder brother of John Bradshawe, the regicide. The regicide was the chief judge who judged Charles I to death. And he was executed in January 1649. And I'm not going to go through all this, but we have there's a financial diary of his in which he records expenses for a couple of years running. And there is a letter book, which is in Oxford University, which contains 130 letters that most people write a letter and then they make a record of their letter in a separate book if they want to keep a record of all the letters that they've written. I can't go into detail about this, but he seems to have composed his letter in his book, because they're full of cross-outs and so forth, and have then transcribed his draft into the letter itself, which was sent. Anyway, these are very interesting letters. Topic for another lecture. There is also a funeral poem on his death, which is now at Yale in the Beinecke Library. And I'm just going to show you just a little bit. This is from his letter book. And what I just want you to do is to have a look at the signatures. At the very bottom of the page, there's HB. Sir, your affectionate friend and servant, HB. Here again at the bottom of the page, there's another HB, followed by something that is just a couple of little, what we call minims. Actually, it's IUN for junior. I and J are the same letter of the alphabet in this time. So it's JUN. A little hard to figure out, but when you know that he referred to himself as junior, there's no problem in interpreting that. There's a little blow up of it. This is a little bit clearer, I think. Here it says Henry Bradshawe book. It's his ownership mark. Here's another book, and this one he paid 1 shilling for, 010. That means £0, 1 shilling, 0 pence. This was apparently purchased in 1637, though that's crossed out. We don't know I don't know exactly why. Here's another one where he's written at the top corner of his of the title page, Henry Bradshawe Jr. his book. And this is a much more it's not so, other signatures are like printing. This is like, connected upright, what the English call connected uprighting, script writing. Here's Henry Bradshawe Jr., his book, another one. Just get used to seeing this version of the Henry Bradshawe signature. Here, there are 2 signatures, one on the top, Henry Bradshawe, and then on the lower down, various versions of, I'm not sure that the first one over on the right is J. Bradshawe or just Bradshawe. There was a John Bradshawe that I'll be talking about, but then Henry Bradshawe, that's clear enough. He's spelled out Henry. And sideways, he's written Hen Bradshawe and so forth. So there are lots of different handwritings. And my puzzle was to figure out who is who in all this mess. Okay. There is now also the question how the Bradshawe Henrys, who lived way up in this little tiny town of Marple in Cheshire, got all their books and their pamphlets. For one thing, the brother John, who lived in London, would send pamphlets to his brother Henry 216 miles away, but if you wait long enough, it'll get there. And this is just a pamphlet that says, for Mr. Henry Bradshawe at his house in Marple. And so this is the way of telling whoever, brought the, whoever was the kind of the postman or acted as a postman, brought these books to Marple. This is the poem written at the death of this Henry, and it gives us very important information. I'm not going to bother with the poem itself, but it says, an elegy upon the much lamented death of Henry Bradshawe of Marple, Esquire, who departed this life March the 11th, Anno Domini 1661. Now, March 1661 is actually 1662 because they didn't change the year date until the 25th of March. So if it's before the 25th of March, they would keep the previous year number, the Anno Domini number. What can we say about this in general about this Henry III? He was a massive collector of pamphlets and controversial literature. There's no English literature in his collection as we would think of it. But there's a lot of all the controversial pamphlets that were published, especially during the course of the English Civil War in the 1640s and the 1650s. So he was a massive contributor, especially to the pamphlet connection, which we're mostly interested in this evening. Henry IV, who died in 1698, and he was, of course, the son of Henry III, was interested in English literature. There are very few books that survive with his signature on, but they are very important. First of all, here's his signature on a letter, Henry Bradshawe. And it is characterized by a quite straight line underneath the signature, crossed by little, I don't know what you would call them even. I'll call them little U's. I hope you can see them. There are, I count maybe 3 or 4 U's. They're probably just like two little marks that he puts on there, though he connects them together. And that's fairly characteristic of his signature. Now, one of the signatures, and maybe if I have time, I'll talk more about this book. This is the second folio of Shakespeare, published in 1632 after the first folio of 1623, which is be celebrated next year, the 400th anniversary. And at the very top of the page is the signature of Henry Bradshawe. And you can see that underneath the signature is a straight line crossed with these little U's. And so that is clearly the signature of Henry Bradshawe IV. Here's another example. I don't have the full title page to show you, but this is Chaucer, collected works of Chaucer. This Henry Bradshawe, it's a little, there's another word added to it. It says Henry Bradshawe Grayensis. He puts Grayensis because he was a member of Gray's Inn, which is one of the inns of court. He has a straight line. I can't see the U's. Maybe there wasn't enough room for the U's to put in there. But anyway, this is the signature of Henry IV. This is a magnificent collection of engravings of county maps, the counties of England and Wales. That had a long and complicated ownership history, but at one time it was certainly owned by Henry Bradshawe IV. There's a little blow up of his signature. The book I'm showing you now, An Answer to a Catholic Englishman. This is part of the religious controversy. It's signed by Henry Bradshawe, the one that we're familiar with from the start, but also H.B. Grayensis. So that was owned by Henry IV and the person that I will designate as Henry V. So very few books, as far as we know, that I've been able to identify were collected by Henry IV, but they were very important English literary books, including Shakespeare and Chaucer. Finally, we come to the person who is, in a way, most important for identifying books from the library, who was Henry V, who died in 1736. Now, what I'm pretty sure happened was that Henry V inherited the library, and he just put his signature on every book in the library. Had nothing to do with either the acquisition of the book, who purchased it, when it was purchased, and so forth. If it was in his, while he was custodian of the library, he just put his name in every book. So it's almost like a library mark. You know, if you can identify books formally in the British Library because it was a stamp or something like this. This is just a stamp. It's completely uninformative in every other respect. There's no date attached. There's no price attached or anything like that. All you know is if you have a book with this signature, it was once in the Bradshawe Library of Marple, Cheshire. I have 3 such examples from my own, which I've been able to collect. I own 8 signatures. of Henry Bradshawe. They're not that hard to find. I wish I could find more, but these came to me quite easily and at no great expense because people don't really know who Henry Bradshaws are. Now, here I'm going to give you evidence that it was Henry V whose signature this belongs to. This is a book from the Trinity College Library in Oxford. At the very top of the title page is, you can see that Henry Bradshawe, the standard signature. At the bottom of the title page, it gives the date, 1729. Okay, all of the rest of the Henry Bradshaws were dead by this date, except for Henry V. And so that is a clear evidence that that is the signature of Henry V. I point this out because book owners, booksellers often always, I would say, get the date wrong. I've got an example of a book that I purchased. When I pointed this out to the man who sold it to me, he knocked 50 pounds off because he got the date and he got the date wrong. I was very grateful to be able to correct him. Most people think that that was the signature of Henry IV, the man who died in 1698. Clearly, it couldn't be. Now, there are two younger brothers that are very important to this collection. And the first, and by far the most important, is John Bradshawe, who was the chief judge at the trial of Charles I. And Charles was executed under the judgeship of John Bradshawe, who he was executed in 1649, the 30th of January, and he died in 1659. It was the best timed death in history, I think, because the restoration occurred the next year, and Charles II tortured any survivors to death who had been on the panel of judges that had been responsible for the execution of his father. So he, along with Oliver Cromwell, escaped this horrible judicial execution because they died just in time. Anyway, so we don't have to lament his death all that much. Now, who was John? This is the warrant for the execution of Charles I. And every little dot is the seal of one of the judges in the jury that condemns him to death. The very first one, you can't really read the signature, but it is the signature of John Bradshawe. And if you look really carefully, you might be able to pick out the name John Bradshawe, but you can certainly pick out the straight line with the little dots on it, with the little crosses on it, which I think is which he used, and I think that his nephew Henry IV imitated his uncle in writing a signature with this little the line beneath. This is the will of John Bradshawe. He was a very astute lawyer because he wrote his will something like 5 years before his death. Almost everybody at the time wrote their will on their deathbed, and sometimes too late. They actually died before they could sign their will. But he wrote it, as you should do, when you're still alive and kicking and feeling in good fettle. So this is his will. It's an original will written in his own hand. There is his signature, a much clearer example of a signature, along with his seal, and you can see the line with the little cuts on it. And he is written again in his own hand. All this was written with mine own hand, and the two words blotted out, and others, the instructions made by myself before the signing thereof and sealing and publishing thereof. So he's tells us that he wrote this in his own hand. Now, I just want to take a minute to look at the characteristics of his hand. If you look at to the left side, you can see Anno Domini 1655. Now, the A, do I have a, no, that's as large as I can make it. The A has a little, instead of a straight bar across the A, it is like a kind of a V. It reminds me of the way children draw birds, you know, just a little like a V shape up in the sky. And look at the D of Domini. It's got two lines, two vertical lines crossing through the D. And it's the same with day later in the same line. At the top of this page, at the very far right, you can see the word trees. The capital T has a huge crossbar on top, you know, much larger than you normally expect, and a little tick halfway down. Okay, so there are, you know, everybody writes differently. So you have to pick out little things that will help you identify the writing, handwriting. Now, the general point I want to make about John Bradshawe is that he never signed his name to any book. You know, there are a couple of books, especially pamphlets, that he signed, and you can't identify them by finding his name, even though there were other Bradshaws who are claimed to be this John Bradshawe, but they're not. You have to identify his ownership by his handwriting. And he annotated books. The rest of the Henrys did not annotate his books. Like most book owners of rare books and so forth, they don't mess up their books or write in the margin. Some do, of course, but a lot of people don't. It's amazing how many people collect books and never read them or never bother to annotate them in any way. Anyway, so just a couple of examples. Here's a book called The State of the Case of the Commonwealth, published in 1654. This is 5 years after the execution. And it has marginal annotations like, here's the necessity of appeals. You can see the A in appeals is his. The D in debate further down the page is clearly his. Look at the word state here. He has this extravagant capital S with little circles across the top and even all down the middle. There are other characteristics that just scream out that this is the hand of John Bradshawe. So if anybody's looking for a doctoral dissertation, going through and finding out all the annotations of John Bradshawe to surviving books, it'd be beyond me. I've just turned 84, so I can't do it. But a person with more time ahead of them might be able to make a good work of it. Here's another book. You can see the T in Times is clearly the Bradshawe T with a wide crossbar. Another thing that he did was he would put the title page, the title of a pamphlet, on the last page, which is sort of the outside back cover of a pamphlet, because pamphlets weren't bound. You know, they were like paperbacks. They weren't bound at all. They were just folded and issued in that way. But he gave the date, the title. You can see the line with little cross ticks. That's his work. And so a lot of the pamphlets which he owns can be identified only by recognizing his handwriting. Here's a really telling inscription in his handwriting. I remember not whether I sent this before, but to be sure I send it now and hold it a very considerable piece. This was clearly written to his brother, Henry III, in Cheshire, saying, I think I might have sent you this before, but since that's so important, I'm going to send you another copy just to make sure that you get it. But this is another indication that he sent pamphlets to his brother in Cheshire. from London. Here is a book, the author being J.M., which we know as John Milton. And he has written on the top, Ex Dono Autoris, a gift from a donation from the author, February 1648. Now, can anybody figure out what date 1648, February 1648 is? Remember that the date change doesn't change. So this is actually 1649, February. It's during the month after Charles was executed. And he got this pamphlet from Milton, and Milton had written a pamphlet defending the execution of the king. It's called The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. So they must have been personally connected. Some people claim that they were cousins, but I don't know exactly how that might have been. This is another book, a law book, which contains the same Latin phrase, proverb, as we saw in the 1597 book, a date of this with a signature dated 1600 of Henry I. Somebody's crossed out a signature, which I desperately tried to figure out. I haven't been able to read under the scribbling. But it is annotated throughout, again, without any indication that this was done by John, that he doesn't sign his name to it, but it's clearly in his hand. I won't go into details, but it's in his hand. And I duplicate the hand here to indicate the connection. Now, there's one more very interesting connection between John Bradshawe and his grandfather, Henry I. In Gray's Inn, one of the Inns of Court in England, is a manuscript that was written by John Bradshawe. It is a transcription in his own hand of that book that belonged to his grandfather. Apparently, he wanted a copy of the whole book, so he just copied the whole book out in his own hand, and that manuscript survives in Gray's Inn. The book itself survives in Middle Temple, which is another Inn of Court, very much all within the legal realm of London. I won't go into details about this, but this is just his kind of doodling at the bottom of a page. You can see they got long lines all crossed by these little ticks. Here's another one. This one is dated 1624. So it's when he was a law student at Gray's Inn that he did this. Okay, so John Bradshawe is a momentous character, much more than I can tell you about, but my point is that he collected pamphlets, he donated pamphlets, sent pamphlets to his brother, and a lot of those pamphlets ended up in the modern collection of pamphlets from the Bradshawe Library. Now, finally, briefly, Thomas. Thomas was the brother of Henry IV. He lived 8 years longer than he did, and I found one book with his signature in it. His signature appears here at the bottom of the inventory of his father's estate. Remember, his father died in 1698. It's maybe too small to read, but at the top of the page, I've got it detailed here. It says item in books, maps, cuts. Cuts are engravings to the value of 40 pounds. So that's 40 pounds is a lot of money, but the library is very large, and the whole library was valued at 40 pounds. And at the bottom of the page, it's a little hard to see, but anyway, it's the signature of Thomas Bradshawe. And this is a book called Gangrena, and it is signed Thomas Bradshawe. So one more Bradshawe adds to the collection. you can see that the book was originally acquired by his grandfather, Henry III, and it says Henry Bradshawe's book, 2 shillings 8 pence is what he paid for it. So that's Thomas. Now, I'm just going to go through the sequence of how this library was built. From Henry I, we have one book, but probably he had more. I mean, who's going to have just one book? But it's the only book that we can identify. Henry II conserved the library, but we don't know what he added to it. Henry III added massively to the library, and John, his brother, established a library of his own. Both libraries were inherited by Henry IV. Okay, John had no children, so he bequeathed all his books to his nephew, who was Henry IV. And he was, Henry IV was also the natural heir of his father, Henry III. So by this time, there was a combined library of substantial proportions. This was and then Henry IV added to it. We know a couple of literary books they added to it. Henry V added to it, and Thomas probably added to it as well. Now, what happened to it after that? Thomas Bradshawe had one daughter, Mary, who married twice. The first marriage was to somebody called William Pimlott, and the second was to Nathaniel Isherwood. By the way, Isherwood is the one important surviving descendant was Christopher Isherwood, who's actually from this same family. So William Pimlott had a son, John, who had a daughter, Elizabeth. She was born in 1759. We have here Elizabeth's signature. I think I don't know if you can make it out, but it says Elizabeth Pimlott. This is when she got married. You had to go to the registrar and register your marriage. She married somebody called Lyndon Evelyn. And her name occurs in one book. You can see the top signature is Henry Bradshawe, the standard signature, but then also Elizabeth Pimlott, her book. So there's one female owner of a book. There's one other book that I think I will get to, who benefited from this. Now, what happened to it after this? Nathaniel Isherwood had an heir, Nathaniel Bradshawe Isherwood, who died in 1765, who had this son, Thomas Bradshawe Isherwood, who died in 1788. The library itself was sold in 1784, 4 years before his death. So clearly it was Thomas Bradshawe who sold the library, and it was just widely distributed at the time. Now, I'm going to go quickly into just a few details about how this library was distributed, was sold in 1784. From the History of Cheshire, which was published in 1819 by George Ormerod, we have the following. The library thus bequeathed continued at Marple until the close of the 18th century. He said the last century, but I put it, it's the 18th century, and was then sold to Mr. James Edwards of Halifax, who was a book dealer, having been augmented probably by later generations of Bradshaws, but also having been most materially injured by rats and damp. So the library was probably already in a dreadful state when it was sold. It was subsequently offered for sale by Messrs. Edwards of Pall Mall, being joined in one catalog with the libraries of Nathaniel Wilson of Pontefract and 2 deceased antiquaries. And the entire collection, according to a writer in the Gentleman's Magazine of 1816, is described as being more splendid and truly valuable than any which had been previously presented to the curious, and such as astonished not only the opulent purchasers, but the most experienced and intelligent booksellers of the metropolis being London. This is typical flowery 19th century writing, but it must have been quite a library. Unfortunately, no catalog survives, which is a tragedy in a way, but even if it did survive, you probably wouldn't be able to distinguish the books of the Bradshawe Library from the books of the other libraries, like there's Nathaniel Wilson of Pontefract, who might have even had a bigger library. So it would be very nice if we had that catalog. Whether it would have helped us a lot, I don't know, but it was recognized as a splendid, truly significant library. So here we have the library going from Thomas Bradshawe, Isherwood, to James Edwards of Halifax, Monsieur Edwards of his Palma. He was, by this time, he was in business with his sons. And what happened after that? There is a gap, and I hope someday to be able to fill in this gap, but I haven't been able to do so. From 1784 to 1868, we don't know what happened to the pamphlet collections, except that by 1868, it got into the library of James Crossley of Manchester, who had a fabulously grand library. He died in 1883, and in 1884, the library was sold. We have another description, this time from 1886, a couple of years later, of that, the sale of the Crossley Library. Judge John Bradshawe was in the custom of buying tracts in London, pamphlets, and sending them to his brother to Marple. These ultimately formed a very fine collection, and they were bound in thick quarto volumes. In these latter days, they got into the library. I love that expression. They got into the library of the late Mr. James Crossley of Manchester. And at the sale of his book in London, they were purchased from the library, almost as inaccessible as his own. Can anybody think of what the next words are going to be? In California. So if you were sitting in London in 1884 and the books were sold to some guy in California, you might think, I'll never see them again. Anyway, California was considered that remote in this time. Anyway, so now we know that the books got into James Crossley's library, and then they were sold to Adolph Sutro, and the sale was in 1884. Now, in the Sutro Library are not only the pamphlets, but there is a copy of Sutro's own copy. There is Sutro's own copy of the sale catalog, which I'm going to show you now. I only saw this about 2 days ago. I was happy on Thursday to get there. Actually, Giles Mandelbrot saw it when he was here in July. He gave a lecture here in July. He told me that he'd seen this. I was very happy to see it. This is a Sotheby catalog of the valuable library of the late James Crossley. And it took 7 days to sell the library. And the total number of lots was almost 3,000. Sutro apparently attended, I don't know if he attended in person or probably maybe by an agent. In any case, he attended the first day sale and the last day sale, the seventh day sale. And on the seventh day sale, there are 3 collections. They're marked here, but I can make it a little bit larger. I'll probably still have to read it to you. There was a series of tracts, 3 groups of tracts. These are lots number 26, 42, 43, and 44. The first was sold for 16 pounds. The second for 60 pounds. And these are bound in 98 volumes. And the third was what I call the Henry Bradshawe tracts at the Sutro Library now, and I'll read it in detail. First of all, it's sold for 39 pounds. Remember, there were about 40 volumes, so it's about a pound a volume for these tracts. And this described as follows: tracts and pamphlets, another set of pamphlets containing, according to the manuscript indexes in each volume, nearly 1,500 in 41 volumes, old calf, that's the bounding. Lettered miscellaneous tracts, volumes 15, the earliest, volume 65, the latest. And they are dated from 1640 to 1690. Now, just think a little bit. If the first volume that was sold at that time was volume 15, that means there must have been 14 volumes that I don't know where they are, but they apparently they didn't get into Crossley's library. There is another note attached to this, which refers mostly to this one, I think, but also to the others. It is impossible to overestimate the importance in an historical point of view of the above extensive and most interesting collections, which could at no time have been got together in the present century. In other words, it'd be impossible to gather that together, that many pamphlets, just buying them one at a time. The latter set is in unusually fine condition. Well, it's pretty beat up, to tell the truth, and contains numerous illustrations and several scarce portraits, such as that of Henry Welby, the Phoenix of Grub Street, 1637. Many of the scarcer pamphlets in this collection are indicated by a slip of paper placed in the volume by the late proprietor, that is by James Crossley. Now, they don't have those slips in them anymore, but they do have at the beginning what we would call a table of contents, much more than an index, a handwritten table of contents. These table of contents and the volumes were inspected in, I believe, in the 1930s under financed by the WPA. The library was indexed, analyzed, and so forth, and as a result of that, we have a fairly good record of what is contained in those volumes, and you can look it up in the Sutro Library online index. Now, often the details of pamphlet by pamphlet aren't available, but you can get a good general sense of the whole collection. Now, that ends my major lecture. That is what I'm trying to explain, is how this Bradshawe Library got established in the first place, and then how it came into the Sutro Library by way of all these intermediaries, of all these successive members of the family, the subsidiary family when they got, were not just Bradshaws, but Bradshawe Isherwoods and so forth. And then two major sales, one in 1784 and the other in 1884. And then how, Sutro came by them, and also the fact that they survived the earthquake, which is really important for me. By the way, if you look carefully, you'll see that the tracts have been underlined in red. I'm not exactly certain what the lot numbers are underlined in red. I'm not sure exactly what this signifies. I rather think that somebody has gone through and said that, yes, those marked in this way still survive today in the library. So that's there. I haven't examined all the pamphlets, but it's possible that whole series of 96 volumes is also survives in the library. I've obviously got a lot more work to do, but I hope that I've been able to give the basic details. Now, I want to ask a question of how we're doing for time.
You have time for a little more and maybe
Okay.
some questions. Yeah,
Okay.
at the top of the hour.
Okay. All right. So I'll go on a little further because there are a couple of particular volumes from the library that I want to discuss. And I think you'll find these interesting. So not only the total collection, which is fabulous in itself, but some of the individual volumes. So I picked out select cases. The first case I want to talk about is this 1632 second folio, which is now at the University of California at Davis. This was owned by Henry IV, who died in 1698. His signature is at the top of the title page. How did this volume get to Davis? Well, we have to go back to 1957, when the University of California, especially organized, I think, by people at UCLA, purchased half of the collection of the Ogden collection, which was one of the largest collections sold during the 20th century. The Ogden, half of it went to the University of London Library, UCL, and the other half was purchased by UCLA, sort of for the whole University of California. And all the rare books collections at the various universities, there are fewer campuses at that time than there are now, got about 10,000 books. Now, these aren't all, historical 17th century, 16th century books. These are from a much larger collection, but Berkeley got 10,000 and Davis got 10,000. It must have been about 60,000 in all. Berkeley and UCLA already had volumes 1 through 4, or the folios 1 through 4 of Shakespeare, all the 17th century folio collections, editions of Shakespeare. That is 1623, 1632, 1663, and 1685. There were 4. So Berkeley and UCLA didn't need them. They already had them. So who were it turns out that the 2 top candidates for these were Santa Barbara and Davis. And somebody had to decide which one got which volume. So some genius decided that they would decide this by having the rare books librarians bet on the outcome of the 1957 World Series. The librarian at Davis bet on the New York Yankees. The librarian at Santa Barbara bet on the Milwaukee Brewers. The Giants won by 1 game. It went 7 games. I may have some sports fan may tell me I haven't got the details right, but anyway, it was decided by betting on the World Series. And as a result of that, the Davis got this wonderful book. Now, not only do we know that it was acquired at some point, long after its publication, by Henry Bradshawe IV, but we also have indications in the book itself that it had an additional life, because here we have Anne Barker. Her name is and the date of 1773. Now, this is long before the sale of the library. So somehow some books from the library must have escaped. Whether the owner, needed to raise some money and just put this volume up for sale, we don't know. But we do know that it got into the hands of this Anne Barker. And it turns out that we can follow her, this family, especially because her son was called Dionysius. How many Dionysius Barkers are there? Were there in England around 1773? Well, there was one, and they lived in Essex. And here is another indication. Wright Barker a man whose first name was Wright. He was the husband of Anne Barker. Anne Barker, it's too common a name, but Wright Barker and Dionysius Barker, that family survived, lived in Stansted, Essex. Stansted Airport, that's right. You recognize the name. And then the family went to what was kind of broken up, or one part of the family moved to Cheshire, which is outside of London, and and became the owner of an inn which survives today. It's called the Haunch of Venison in Cheshire. I haven't got out to look at this place, but I dearly want to. And just to imagine this family moving in here with their copy of the second folio of Shakespeare. So that's one story. This is another story. This is a book signed by Henry Bradshawe. I'll enlarge it, I believe. There it is, Henry Bradshawe. And at the top right, there's the name Eliza. Okay, I'm going to go back and read you the title page. And remember, this book came from the library, which included works, a contribution by John Bradshawe, who was the chiefly responsible for the execution of Charles I. The title of this page, and notice that it's made even more remarkable, significant, more regal by putting the red lines around the title page. The glories and magnificent triumphs of the blessed restitution of His Sacred Majesty King Charles II from his arrival in Holland in 5960 till this present, comprising all the honors and grandeurs done to and conferred by him, and so forth. So this is a celebration of the return of Charles II. And it just seems so odd that this book would survive in the library of the Puritan family. But it must have been in the library by the time Henry Bradshawe was, so that's 2 generations later. And I'm not certain about what I'm going to sort of claim next, but I will put it out for you. And I think that this Eliza is Elizabeth Plymouth's hand, and that she too owned this book. So this would be a second book owned by Elizabeth Plymouth, if I'm right. I look at this one day and I think, it's not quite the same. Look at it again and say, well, it's in a kind of cramped space, so she must have kind of adjusted it. But I think it's still worth opining that this might very well have got into the hands of Elizabeth Plymouth. The next book is called A Brief Relation of Sir Walter Raleigh's Troubles, published in, 1669. Now, Sir Walter Raleigh himself was long dead since then. Of course, he was executed under James I. But at the top of the page, it said, presented by Mr. C.R., son of Sir W. Raleigh, 23rd March, 1648. And this C.R. is almost certainly Christopher Raleigh, who was I believe, the grandson of, no, he's the son of Walter. He was, because Raleigh was executed under royal warrant, the family was stripped of all its lands, and Christopher Raleigh was trying to get the lands back. So he was trying to butter up the present government. But notice also that this was written right after, in March, just 2 months after the execution of Charles I. And so he was appealing not to the royal government, not to Charles's government, but to what became Oliver Cromwell's government. I don't think it worked, but nevertheless. So it was presented, oh, and this is in the handwriting of John Bradshawe. So it must have been, a copy of this must have been given to John Bradshawe by Christopher Raleigh himself. And one final, and then I'll open for questions, book published in 1565, but signed by Henry Bradshawe. So it was in the library. It was published much earlier, but in the library when he had control of it. And it is signed also by somebody called Philip Oldfield. And he turned out to be a man who's celebrated in Cheshire, in Chester, and has a tomb monument within the cathedral of, it's not within the cathedral church, but in a parish church in Chester. So we have another example of a book that was previously owned by somebody, and then sold on and got into the Bradshawe Library. If you can excuse me, I'm just going to run over and get one of the books that I've put out on display. I can't really show this, but I will just try to describe it. This is a book published in 1610, and it's called Arachnakeia, or the Office of the Justice of the Peace in 4 books, and so forth. That tells you how to be a good justice of the peace. It's signed Henry Bradshawe, but at the top is another name that's been crossed out in this fiendishly effective manner of just kind of drawing loops and circles through a previous name. And every once in a while I take this out, I look at it and see if I can just figure out what name that might possibly be underneath. I'm hoping that it's the signature of Henry III, because I don't have any books signed by him. I'd give a lot to find one. But then there also seems to be a date or maybe a price at the top of the page. So there are a lot of mysteries when you are trying to figure out former owners, because some owners efface the evidence of the former owner for one reason or another. And so it makes a kind of a difficulty and a mystery for us. Well, that is the end of my little story about the pamphlet collection of the Bradshaws and how they got into the Sutro Library. So I'm ready for questions.
Do we have any questions? Over here.
The subject of the pamphlets themselves.
Yes.
You elaborate a little bit on that.
Okay, so the question is the subject of the pamphlets themselves. Most of the pamphlets are part of this, they're called controversial, which means they are debates about either politics or religion. And from 1640 to 1660, there was an explosion of pamphlet literature written with ferocity on both sides of any issue that you could name. It's a kind of, it's often said that there would have been no Reformation by Martin Luther except for the printing press. I won't say there wouldn't have been a civil war without it, but it was a way of communicating your grievances, of trying to defend your point of view. And there's this huge pamphlet literature. Tens of thousands of pamphlets were published at that time. So even if you got all the Bradshawe pamphlets together, it might be about 10% of all the pamphlets that were published during this time. But it's evidence of that remarkable set of publishing industry of the period. Yes.
Did the Bradshaws end up with any of the medical or scientific pamphlets? The pamphlet was, say, the 1650s and 60s?
Okay, good question. Did the Bradshaws have any medical or scientific pamphlets? I would say no. that there may be one or two, but there aren't many. And because I'm very interested in the history of science, I would more personally than in the history of politics. I wish there were, but no. I mean, they had their own interests and they stuck to them. This does bring up one issue that kept coming to my mind when I was reading through, when I was trying to work out the biographies of these individual men, and that is, what connection did they have to the legal establishment of London? Now, two of them, John Bradshawe attended Gray's Inn, and Henry IV attended Gray's Inn, but did not advance to the bar. This gives me the opportunity to describe one of the letters in that letter book that Henry III was amassed. And this was a letter to his son, who at the time was a student at Christ's College, Cambridge. And it's a kind of letter that you would write to his son. We maybe don't do this anymore because there was a certain amount of kind of cruelty or threat to this thing about, here we spent all this, brought you up right, spent all this money on you, and what are you doing? You're neglecting your studies at Cambridge. And he advised his son to stick to it with his tutor and to stay the required 3 years at Cambridge to get his BA. He doesn't go into in too much detail, but there is a kind of saying, okay, just stick to your books. The son did not do that. Instead, he went to London and he became a member of Gray's Inn and he studied law. I think under the influence of his uncle, I think he was more swayed by his uncle than by his father. And maybe this is one of the reasons why his uncle John was so happy because he became a kind of protege of his uncle in studying law. But none of them went to the advance to the bar. And how about Henry I, who had this book by Plowden, a very important legal tract, and he also contains that phrase, if you want to study law, you must read. It suggests he must have been a member of the Inns of Court or something, must have studied law, but there's no evidence. He's not his name doesn't occur in the admissions registers. And the family seemed to be intensely interested in the law. They were well educated, even though none of them seemed to have gone to the university until Henry IV did. But his father didn't. But his father was certainly fluent in Latin. He quotes Latin all the time. And where he got his education, he's probably like Shakespeare, who went to the local grammar school, which brought up their pupils in Latin to the point of probably what it would, the equivalent of a master's degree in classics today. So, but why we don't have more evidence of their connection to Inns of Court, I don't know. Thank you for the question.
If we have one last question, yeah, sure.
Okay.
I've been interested in the conflicts of the Royal Society, the Royal Archbishops, the apothecaries for 50 years. And it is very hard to find these pamphlets. And when you find them, you can sometimes get away because of cost. So this treasure trove we have here is really extraordinary.
Right. Yeah. I gave a version of this talk at Stanford, 6 months ago now, more than that. And David Como, who is a 17th century historian, Civil War historian, was there, and he said, "You don't realize how important your topic is." And I'm right. I'm not a historian, but I do think it's an extremely undervalued resource, and it's just waiting there.
Well, the whole Sutro Library is going to be valuable.
Absolutely. Yeah. I go there some days, and I'm the only reader. So.
Let's
Okay, I
let's
don't-
wrap up unless you have another comment.
No, I was just wondering, would the Zoom people have,
There was one question, only one question on Zoom, and I can
Okay.
actually get that for you. Is there still a Bradshawe estate in Marple?
no. The hall was demolished in 1927. And the family, I'm sure there are still Isherwoods or Bradshaws around, but I don't know of any present representatives of the family. There were some in the 19th century. Whether there are any, I've not tried to get in touch with any, so. But maybe there's somebody out there on Zoom who
Who knows?
who could inform me. Thank you.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you again to Professor Alan Nelson, and round of applause. And thank you to you for being here at the book club this evening for this program. Our next program is a few weeks away. It's going to be Monday, December 12th here in San Francisco. It'll also be streamed online via Zoom, and it's the 4th Kenneth Carmiole Endowed Lecture. It's titled The Surprising Legacy of Alice Parsons Millard, antiquarian bookseller and champion of beauty and taste. We have some cards about that lecture on the table on your way out if you'd like to grab one. It's going to be an illustrated talk by author, historical consultant, and retired research librarian Charles Nelson Johnson. So you can register to attend that event or any event that the book club has by looking for your program's emails that you're probably getting from the book club now. You can sign up there, and you can also go to our website at bccbooks.org/programs to register for our events. So thank you everyone for being with us this evening. We look forward to seeing you again here in the club rooms or in our online community. Thanks everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.